Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's session, Navigating Overhead Functions in Mission-Driven Organizations. Before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Moss Adams webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% or 3 of the 4 polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. Polling questions will appear within the slide window. To participate in the polls, please click on your answer and be sure to hit the Submit button to record your response. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry, if you can't download your CPE certificate today, we'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet to receive credit. The attendance sheet is available in our slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit only can be awarded to participants registered as themselves, and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge the recent big news that Moss Adams is joining forces with Baker Tilly to create a new firm, one designed to serve the needs of the middle market. This is really exciting, and you can read more about it on our website from the link in the console. Now, today we have several Moss Adams team members with us to share their insights on the topic. Annie Rose Favreau, Director, and Maria Stroth, Senior Manager, both with our Strategies and Operations Group. Brett Addis, Director and part of our Human Capital Advisory team. Amy Ahyo, Director in Finance Operations, and Chuck Andrews, Director with our Risk and IT Compliance Group. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Annie Rose to get the presentation started.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We are really happy to see you all and to be talking about this important topic. So for our next hour with you all, we want you to be able to walk away at the end of it with ideas about improving the cost effectiveness, the efficiency of overhead functions when we're thinking about things like finance and IT and HR. These are all really, really critical engines that drive your work. And when we're in a moment of potential funding uncertainties, when we're trying to be as efficient and effective in the way that we do our work, it can be important to look at these different areas and really understand what is driving costs in these areas, what are the opportunities to make these areas more efficient and more effective in the services that they provide to the rest of your organization. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. In terms of our agenda, we have just some overview pieces to make sure we're all oriented, using the same language as we work through the rest of the webcast together. And then we're going to hear from a couple different folks in finance, HR, and IT. So we're going to be going kind of deep dives with Amy, Brett, and Chuck in those areas. And then at the end, we're also going to talk a little bit about risk management approaches. So Maria and I are going to get into some of the ways that we can think about managing risks, how those are related to your overhead costs, your internal services, and some tools that can be used to help monitor these areas over time, as well as other areas of your organization as well. So we're going to close out on some risk management pieces there. Hopefully we will have time for questions at the end. If we do not, though, please put questions in that Q&A box. We would love to hear from you. If we're not able to answer questions as we go through, we will follow up with you as well. There's always really interesting perspectives that come in through that Q&A box. So please do feel free throughout the presentation to put information in there, and we will either try and answer it in the moment or answer it as a follow-up as well. So with that, we would actually love to hear, we're going to have a couple polling questions as we go through, and we wanted to start off by just getting a better sense of kind of who's in the room with us today. We know we have a lot of folks here. This is for mission-driven organizations, but that covers a pretty wide range. So we would love to hear if you are coming from the public sector, from nonprofits, foundations, higher ed, or something else as well. So we're hoping that you can take this moment to fill in our first polling question, get used to the structure here. If you have any questions or concerns around how the polls are being submitted, please feel free to put that in the chat as well, and we'll try and follow up with you there in terms of technical support. But we wanted to get a better sense of the general kind of scope of who's with us today, so that we can also make sure that as we're going through our different sections, we can be tailoring it to the folks who are in the room. So I see about 75% of you have submitted so far. Danielle, shall we give another 30 seconds or so here to make sure that folks have time to submit? Fantastic. Okay, so Danielle will move us forward once we've got enough of you coming through on this one. I feel like a lot of the recent, oh, and here we go. We already have it. So fantastic. We have a good chunk of you from the public sector, from the government area, as well as from not-for-profit. Higher ed are both above 20%, and we have some folks from foundations and some folks from something else. So that's great. We have a pretty good spread here. Thank you all so much for going through that with us. Okay, so then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Maria to do a quick intro here, just in terms of overhead functions in this particular moment in time.
Thank you so much, Annie Rose. And I just want to echo the warm welcome to everyone, and thank you all for being here. As Annie Rose mentioned, I wanted to just sort of lay some foundation in terms of definitions and the language that we are using throughout this presentation, so that we're all on the same page and approaching this conversation from that lens. So when we're thinking about overhead functions, we're thinking about the administrative and support services that are necessary for your organization to operate, but they don't necessarily directly contribute to program delivery. So these are really important functions necessary to support your organization in achieving your mission. And oftentimes we're thinking about examples like finance, human resources, information technology, and facilities when we're thinking about overhead functions, which we may also refer to as internal services throughout this presentation. Understanding overhead costs can really help your organization allocate resources more effectively and help you ensure resilience and impact with the areas that you are trying to achieve with your mission and goals. We're thinking about both fixed costs and variable costs when we're thinking about overhead costs. So fixed costs being things like salaries and rent, and variable costs being things that vary month to month, like your utility charges, office supplies, and travel expenses. It's important to focus on overhead costs at any time. It's especially important right now. Recent reductions in federal funding and increased competition for grants have really created a challenging financial environment. I'm sure this is not news to anyone. I know many of the folks that we are working with are really thinking through changes to the funding availability that they have access to, thinking about how to manage expenses right now, just to make sure that the organizations are resilient and able to really sustain operations in a meaningful way moving forward. Of course, with economic downturns and policy changes and just shifting priorities at different levels of government, that can affect funding availability and also operational stability. So thinking about and assessing your overhead costs right now can really help you remain viable and be able to respond effectively. So be flexible and adaptable in these times of changing conditions. Understanding your overhead costs can allow you to make data-driven decisions about resource allocation. It allows you to be responsive to changing circumstances. And doing an assessment of your overhead costs requires you, one, to know what your overhead costs are. So that's certainly something to be thinking about. What are our overhead costs? What's driving those overhead costs? And then how can we maybe create more efficiencies and effectiveness to be able to reduce overhead costs, or at least to be able to make sure that every dollar we're spending in internal service areas is really effective and has sort of a return on investment. So you'll hear us talk a lot about cost effectiveness throughout this presentation. Doing an assessment like this of overhead costs can really help you to identify where inefficiencies are and make sure that you're reducing costs where possible and emphasizing efficiency in your internal services. It can also help you have transparency internally to really understand how things are working, as well as with your stakeholders and funders, which can of course build trust and support, which is especially important right now where we may be leaning on donors or other funders to help us fill some of these budget gaps. So we're gonna move into our next polling question. And we're going to be talking throughout this presentation about finance. We're going to talk about HR. We're going to talk about IT. So I really wanted to get a sense from folks, what are your biggest challenges in terms of managing these various overhead costs that you have? Is it a lack of a comprehensive picture of what is being spent? Do we need to sort of understand what our overhead costs are? Is it understanding what's driving increases in overhead costs? Is it challenges to reduce those overhead costs? Maybe it's all of the above or something else. And we'll just give folks a couple minutes to respond to this poll. Try to get as many folks as we can here.
And Maria, I'm curious what you're seeing with a lot of your clients. I feel like I'm seeing a lot of difficulty even being able to parse out what is actually driving some of the cost increases and sort of what the options and flexibility might be within that. What are you seeing a lot of?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I think a lot of folks are falling into that B bucket from what I'm seeing. We sort of know what our overhead cost buckets are, but can we disaggregate that and dig down a little bit deeper to really understand what are the drivers, what are the causes of increasing overhead costs, especially as organizations have grown a ton, we've added staffing, we have new systems, we've changed our processes, right? All of those things can sort of contribute to increases. So that's where I'm seeing things fall. On my end, it looks like we have about 89% perfect. We're going to move on forward. So let's see what folks are saying. Interesting. So we're seeing lots of folks with challenges to reduce overhead costs, which makes a lot of sense. Again, as I was mentioning, we're seeing a lot of change in our organizations, right? Growth, changes in technology. And so as things become more complex and as things grow, it can become more and more challenging to reduce overhead costs. So I'm hopeful that throughout this presentation, we'll give you some ideas, some tips, some tricks to be thinking about to start to help feel a little bit better in that area. Okay, and I'm going to pass it over to Amy to get us started on the finance side.
Thanks, Maria. Forward. So why should you streamline financial processes? When processes aren't efficient in the accounting department, it can force you to spend more overhead dollars on additional staff, and it can also really frustrate the entire organization. Overhead dollars are important, but the resource of time is even more important. All managers have to interact with accounting, and we want that to be a quick and painless process. Making sure that we're doing things efficiently the first time can give you the space to reallocate your staff. We are going to talk about some of the processes within accounting where I commonly see room for improvement that can make a big difference in how you're spending overhead dollars. Finally, in times of uncertainty, you need data quickly. Ideally, there's real-time reporting you're looking at, but in the absence of that, you need financial statements with enough time to course correct. Streamlined processes make the job easier, which can result in quicker financial statements. You also want to stay very timely with your grant drawdowns, and minimizing reporting delays is important for that as well. Procurement is one of the easiest places to find efficiency and time, although changing the processes can be painful. The first place is in contract management. A lot of organizations struggle with how long it takes to get a contract signed. And I hear a lot about the black hole of contracting, where nobody knows what the status is, what the next step is, and when the contract might be signed. Bringing transparency to this, either with contract management software or a smart sheet with automated status updates, is very helpful. Also making sure that managers know what is required the first time so that contract specialists don't have to keep sending the contract back can make a big difference. And then put some kind of monitoring in place to make sure everybody is following the terms of the contract so that all that work you've done in the front end isn't wasted when nobody is tracking the dollars later. Purchase orders can be annoying at the front end, but they speed up the payment process on the back and ultimately make everybody's job easier. They also let you see how much money has already been spoken for, which gives you a better idea of your free cash flow. Making sure everybody is using their POs properly, that there isn't a lot of back and forth, and that POs get approved quickly can make purchasing go much faster. Remember that back and forth costs money and time, and you want to limit that time waste. Vendor verification should be done on the front end, not when you're trying to go last minute payment out. Making this a proactive, routine task can take vendor verification down to just a few hours each month instead of a person's full-time job. And finally, payment processing. Accounts payable clerks spend so much of their job chasing down information, figuring out why a PO doesn't match to an invoice, tracking down invoices that a vendor says hasn't been paid, following up on approvals, cutting checks, mailing checks. It's a lot of work and a lot of room to find time. Making sure everything is ready to go when it gets to an accounts payable clerk is crucial to managing your overhead cost. Eliminating manual processes, especially with cutting checks, can save a lot of time. A lot of organizations are relying on sending out ACHs, which is great, unless the bank software doesn't integrate with the accounting software. And then your AP clerk is spending a lot of time inputting payment information to two places. Examining your processes within procurement and really questioning how things are done is a great way to lower your overhead dollars and is worth the investment. Month-end close. So how many business days have to pass before you get financial statements right now? Is it 5 days? Is it 7 days, 12 days even, or longer? Do you get statements you can use? Month-end really needs to be an efficient process so that you can get your results that allow you that time to course correct. And especially in this current environment, the grant drawdowns need to happen as soon as possible, which is difficult to do if you don't have a solid month-end close. You want to make sure your accounting department is using a checklist of some kind that lays out deadlines and responsibilities. I like that to be in a place where everybody can see it. If it's something the department is really struggling with, then put it on a whiteboard for everybody to see the status in the office. Find out where the roadblocks are. I bet accounting is working as fast as they can, and they're waiting for information from other departments, and those departments don't realize that they are slowing the whole thing down. When month-end close is not streamlined, it costs you time, and that can lead to feeling understaffed and a pressure to hire more people when if you spent your time fixing these processes, it would ultimately save your overhead dollars and lead to happier employees. I'm going to pass this to Brett now for some HR improvements.
Thank you, Amy, and thank all of you for having me. There's a lot going on in HR. I want to share a few testimonials, I guess, if you will, or examples of what we're seeing in the market from an HR cost and effectiveness perspective, and then I'll dive a little bit into some of the reasons behind that, some drivers, et cetera. But I would say over the last 8 to 12 months, we have been seeing a lot from organizations really expressing interest to understand cost and efficiencies that relates to the HR department in a handful of ways. The first is really around looking at the organizational efficiencies itself. So one of the areas is not only looking at organizational structure, resources, FTEs, FTE costs, but even diving into some of those program and process efficiencies. So we'll get into some of the programs in a minute, but really looking at what HR actually delivers to the business, and are those programs and services of value add? And if they are, great, how do we improve them? How do we optimize them? How do we make them better? And if they're not, the big question is really, do we need them anymore? Another big area that we've been focusing on with our clients is around compensation, and really looking at overall compensation models to really look how we can shift how we are rewarding our employees, whether that be through rewards or recognition, but also looking at different aspects of pay itself. So should we be moving to more of a pay for performance model where we can, in some instances, start to look at future hiring at a lower base salary and provide incentives that actually would take them above where they would normally be at the current market rate, and really pushing some accountability back to the employees, but also, as I mentioned, creating sustainable compensation, which is lowering the cost, but also the direct cost, but also providing upside for some of the employees. Benefits has been another major area that we've been focusing on, and really looking at both compensation and benefits as it relates to total rewards. And again, this is another massive area that when you really start diving into a lot of organizational benefits, the question is one, are our employees using them? Two, what are the costs associated with what is and not being used? And then the third option is, how do we redeploy, or how do we just take some of those benefits away because they're just not value added being used, and how are there some efficiencies there? And then there's a lot of other things going on, even as it relates to work-life balance and providing stipends to remote workers for computers and monitors and all of these other things. So the industry from an HR perspective is really shifting tremendously as we're starting to look at a lot of the cost models. So some of the approaches that we traditionally use when we go in, and there's predominantly four, and the first one I kind of mentioned is the functional cost analysis, and that's really looking at the overall functions, or what I would call programs, across HR, whether that's talent acquisition, talent management, learning and development, all of those things, and really breaking down from a cost of operations and a delivery perspective. Learning is traditionally one of those areas that most organizations cut initially. That's probably the wrong thing to do, to be honest, but it's an easy thing to do because you're reducing licenses and things like that versus people. Downside is it definitely has an impact on employee population in terms of growth and productivity and skill growth and things like that. But that's probably one of the biggest areas that we initially take a look at, and it comes back again not only to value, but the operational efficiency and effectiveness. The second is around activity-based costing, and so this kind of is very close to time-driven analysis, but activity-based costing is really looking at the activities we do. For example, recruiting, could be performance reviews, it could be learning and development, things like that, and really defining what those costs are for that activity. What's really interesting is I'm sure most of your experiences, there is a skill shortage. It's getting more difficult to hire, and in return, it costs more to hire, not only from a advertisement perspective, salaries are going up, marketing is going up. So, are there ways that we can look at that and create more efficiency from a cost perspective, but also effectiveness from a process perspective? The third thing we traditionally do is benchmark. So there's a lot of different techniques out there to look at this, but I highly recommend we benchmark operations. We'll look at benchmarking compensation, benchmarking benefits, benchmarking processes, and really trying to understand is our organizations where they should be from a competitive differentiator. Are organizations spending way too much time and money doing things that they shouldn't? And what are those opportunities of improvement that we can really focus on in terms of driving a lot more effectiveness? And then the last piece, which is probably one of my favorites and where the rubber hits the road, is time-driven analysis. And this is the old adage of basically it's looking at tasks and really breaking it down in terms of who is doing what at how much time and what does that cost. So for example, if you look at something like learning, how much time is it actually taking to develop a curriculum? How much is it taking to schedule the course? How much is it taking to deliver the course? How much is it taking to follow up on the course? That's hours and hours and hours of time and cost. So the big opportunity there is really by breaking it down to that time-based analysis allows you to really evaluate where there are efficiencies and where we can cut time and therefore for cost. So those are just some of the high-level approaches. There's several other that we won't get into today, but I also wanted to dive into some of those drivers that we're seeing in the market. And there's really 5 core drivers from an HR perspective that are really the tip of the spear when we see some of the big hits. And the first one is, of course, labor costs. Right? I don't think anyone's going to question that. It's your salaries, your benefits, your training, all of those things. And it takes on average about 72 to 78% of the total budget from a spend perspective, which is pretty significant. The second is recruitment or retention. So I used that example a moment ago. It's traditionally 10% to 18% of HR budget spent on advertising, agency fees, background checks, candidate screenings, interviews, all of these things, which I'm sure you're experiencing right now, as I mentioned, with the talent shortage, is adding up very quickly. Tech and systems is number 3rd on the list, and it's averaging about 8 to 12% of the total HR spend. Now, there's a lot of variability here. So the question is, are you using just a couple modules from a system? Are you using a full HRIS platform? So there are different variables to consider. And then there's other external costs. For example, like learning. Are you using LinkedIn Learning to pull in content? Are you building your own learning? But in reality, it is still a fairly major cost. And then the last 2 is the employee programs and services, which I alluded to earlier, which is really looking at overall programs and services that HR provides. And we're averaging about 3 to 7% of the HR budget. And then last but not least, and Chuck's going to talk a little bit more about risk, or Annie Rose is going to talk about risk, is around compliance and risk management. And this is actually a really interesting one. As I was going through this research, I was a bit surprised to see this as the least amount, which is 3 to 5% of HR budgets. We've been seeing and hearing a lot based on policy changes, based on shifting of laws and regulations, especially in the Northwest around transparency and equity and all these other things, that some of these costs might be a little bit higher than the others. So again, these are probably some of the major drivers that we're seeing. We could provide you with a whole laundry list of others, but I would say for this purpose, we can actually jump to the next slide, which is some opportunities for more efficiencies, and then I'm going to hand it over to Chuck. So first and foremost, I think is really around technology operations or optimization, is really looking at your current landscape and also looking at costs of other potential providers to determine what you actually need versus what you have. It can create a lot of automation. Of course, I'll throw out AI just because that's a great buzzword today to really drive efficiencies. Shared services model, again, coordinating multiple HR activities and administrative tasks to really drive more strategic activities to the business. Process streamlining, which is pretty self-evident. Strategic outsourcing. I will say that outsourcing is a strategy, not an activity. And so not outsourcing is not a one size for every company. So that is something to think through as you consider that. And then lastly is probably workforce planning and cross-training. Workforce planning and cross-training. Workforce planning is really around understanding your talent demand and being very proactive in terms of putting the right strategic approaches to hiring, as when hand hiring, or I should say promoting or defining successors or future roles for future jobs. And then to prepare for that would be cross-training. So you'd save a lot of efficiencies there in terms of leveraging a lot of the talents you have. So I am going to wrap this up, and then Chuck, I am going to hand it over to you to dazzle us with some IT.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate that. So I want to talk a little bit about IT impacts and improvements and kind of start with IT challenges today. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because it's going to be a lot of repetitive information from what you've heard before. Resource uncertainty, uncertainty related to grants or a lack of grant funding, market volatility impacting investors. We're also seeing, and I'm hearing this from my clients, an increased demand for development or action by non-government organizations. Foundations are being looked to replace potentially what's been redirected by policy changes. And finally, constituent expectations for technology. Amazon hasn't done us a whole lot of favors in terms of user expectations for the user experience. So while you're having to do more with less, the expectations of users are increasing across all constituents, be it applicants, grantees, students. They all want a seamless experience with systems, and that can be quite the challenge. Looking at IT overhead impacts, I think that one of the biggest impacts that we see is upstream system disconnects. And to take a minute here to talk about the whole cloud revolution that really we're kind of knee deep in, that's been going on for quite some time. The cloud availability of systems has kind of driven a best of breed approach to systems. I potentially have one system for grants. I have another one for my financial management, another vendor coming in for HRIS. And so we see a lot of best of breed that potentially lacks coordination. How do I bring all of this best of breed together and get my systems coordinated? And that's really driven problems in the back office, because in many cases, those upstream systems are sources of revenue data, sources of expense data. And this can kind of wreak havoc when you have to make sense out of that data and get the transactions recorded or the impact of the transactions recorded. I joke around a lot where I tell people that no problem starts in the back office. And I think that I can't necessarily make a sweeping generalization there, but problems tend to be driven from upstream systems that are potentially supporting development or program delivery and trying to ferret that out. And really those upstream system disconnects, they manifest themselves in challenges recording the transactions and the impact of the transactions. And to further complicate matters, that gives you a lack of timely visibility because of that recording. And so upstream disconnects, I think, is a huge impact. System implementation gaps is another. And this is where we see where systems have been implemented. You're paying for your annual subscription for the system, and you don't have all of the functionality that system brings to bear implemented or adopted, maybe implemented, but no one's using it or they're not using it correctly. And this can really impair the function of processes. Amy mentioned procure to pay earlier on the spend side. We do encounter a lot of situations where we have a system implementation gap that's causing multiple approvals or excessive reviews of transactions, that really there's a departure from the budget owner, and it's kind of a review after the fact. And so we see some duplicative effort going on in many cases as it relates to these system implementation gaps. And really at the end of the day, it devalues the system. And so you're not getting the value out of your spend. And that can really be a challenge, particularly when it adds time slices to the organization, particularly the supporting elements of the organization. And finally, another impact is aging systems and applications. They can introduce technical debt, where you're having to pay people to keep those systems up to date, to deal with updates, to deal with workarounds. And in many cases, aging systems can prevent engagement with constituents. And so basically they create a barrier between you and the community that you're serving or the donors that you're trying to engage. And that can really be a challenge. And so looking at those aging systems and determining where do I go with this, because typically new systems, while the base cost may be higher, the variable cost is much more controlled and tends to be less. And so those are kind of the three overhead impacts that we see related to IT. In looking at optimizing that, I always kind of take a question and answer approach. And the first one being, are your existing technology assets fully implemented? And when I ask that question, you get to think through the lens of efficiency. And so when I'm looking at that, I'm thinking about approvals. And I know I sound like a broken record with Amy, but a lot of this stuff is contingent upon other areas, right? So we look at approvals. Bank reconciliation. Are we integrated, and can bank recon happen quickly? Another big one that we encounter is donation and merchant bank reconciliation. Figuring out if the deposit matches the donations for the day or the week, or however that system is set up, and where you charge the appropriate fees related to those donations. These are use cases that we see again and again where you can gain efficiency by getting some of these things under control and automated. Can any technical debt be eliminated? And I think the first question to ask there is, where is my technical debt, right? Have I identified it? Do I understand that I've got an anchor here that needs to be addressed? This can be in the form of an old system, as I mentioned earlier, but it can also be in the form of that upstream integration challenge or lack of integration, where I'm paying for best of breed systems, but everything isn't working in harmony and things aren't integrated. And what I look for there always is, can I get any quick wins, like potentially an integration platform to deal with that upstream data? Also, are my upstream systems mapped correctly to my general ledger structure? If they're not, I'm never going to get the data within the downstream system that I need because there's not alignment there. So that's one of the things that I see with procurement systems, with HRIS systems, is, do I have that general ledger structure alignment, not only in my natural accounts, but also in my reporting dimensions or segments? Is all of that stuff tying out? In many cases, you can find quick wins there that really don't involve a technology change. They just involve getting the technology you have under control. And finally, on the IT optimization side, and again, this ties back to people, as Brett was getting into, is, are your system skills aligned with contemporary IT? There is definitely a trend away from infrastructure talent, the weight of that infrastructure talent, to application and business analysts or application owners. Because of the cloud, a lot of the infrastructure overhead is being taken off an organization, and organizations need to lean in on the processes, and they need to look at application and business analysts versus the old school of IT, where I'm just trying to keep servers alive. In this case, what you're trying to do is optimize processes. And do you have the skills aligned to do that? In some cases, they don't live in IT. Those process owners or those application owners may exist within development. They may exist within accounting. But depending on how the organization is designed, you've got to ferret that out. And so I think it's kind of a two-pronged approach there with technology and people and process. And so that's what we're looking at from the IT optimization standpoint. And again, it's asking those questions. And I think I have our next polling question coming up here. We'll start here with which internal service areas are the biggest challenge within your organization? Is it finance, human resources, IT, all the above, or something else? And I'll restate the question, which is which internal service area or overhead service area are we talking about here? Because I'll tell you, I know there's upstream problems. I know you're having challenges with development and program delivery as well, but here we're talking about internal service areas. So we'll give a couple more minutes here. I think we're at about 60%. Okay, looks like we're at 80%. And so we'll go ahead and continue on. And here's the breakdown on that. I see quite a bit of all the above. So work to be done. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Annie Rose to get into our next topic.
Thank you. And I'm not surprised to see that breakdown of all of the above, and then the rest of y'all were kind of split up amongst these areas, because we know that not only are these areas often interconnected with each other, they influence each other, but they're also areas that a lot of times when we're really focused on service delivery, these can be some of those areas that get a little bit put on the back burner sometimes. So it's exciting to see people, coming and saying, okay, we need to make these more of a focus moving forward as well. So risk management approaches. In our last couple of minutes together with you all, we did want to go through some risk management pieces. And I do want to start off with a definition, just because depending on your sector, depending on your background, risk management might mean different things to different people. So within this context, we're thinking about how are we managing the risks that could get in the way of your ability to deliver your goals, to deliver your mission? That's the kind of simplest way of thinking about it. But ideally, risk management is something that is done in a systematic way, where we're identifying risks, assessing risks, prioritizing them to say what's the most important thing that we need to be paying attention to, and then monitoring risks over time as well. And the goal here is to be able to say, okay, here are our known knowns. Here's the risks that we know about and the risks that we can do something about, and how can we mitigate those? And here's all that big bucket of the unknowns as well. And we wanted to bring up risk management here, especially in relation to overhead functions, internal service functions, and overhead costs, because risk management can play a really fantastic role in how you are thinking about those overhead costs. How are we thinking about the internal services that we are delivering? And can we identify risks, challenges that are coming up so that we can solve them in these areas? So a lot of times when we're doing risk management, we're finding things like administrative inefficiencies or compliance issues, or major risks where if we have not done the work on the IT side, we might be opening ourselves up to risk. And that's true in finance and HR as well. And so risk management can be a really fantastic set of tools, or can provide you with that set of tools that can help you make sure that you are looking at your internal services in a regular way and identifying those inefficiencies, identifying the related risks so that you can be proactively managing your costs, managing your risks, and thinking about that long-term operational integrity. How are we setting ourselves up for success, even when there are a lot of things out in the world that are very uncertain in this moment? So there's 3 different risk management tools that we wanted to briefly touch on. Again, any one of these topics we could spend hours on, but we wanted to at least share some of the key ones that we are seeing a lot of our clients take right now, especially mission-driven clients who are trying to think about how are we looking at risk overall. So an enterprise risk assessment, how are we assessing our risk? Thinking about financial contingency planning. This one is huge right now. If a major funding source were to go away, how well prepared are we to meet that need? And then finally, performance audits. So Maria and I are going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail, but because we want to get you to your 4th polling question before we hit the 15-minute mark, we figured we'd put this here. We know we have some, you may be more or less familiar with all of the items on this list, but we wanted to hear which risk management tool are you most interested in learning about, both in terms of the next 15 minutes together, but also for a potential future webcast as well. So we have that enterprise risk assessment, financial contingency planning, performance audits, all of the above, or maybe none of the above. A lot of the organizations we work with, risk management might be a strength of the organization, and that is great for us to know as well. So we wanted to get a sense from the room of sort of where folks are landing with these various risk management pieces. And it looks like about 60% of you have put something in right now. I feel like the biggest conversations that I'm having with folks at this moment in time is around that financial contingency planning. If you haven't already started that process, I think that this one's coming up pretty strongly for folks. But I am very curious to see sort of where this group plans out. We've got about 70% clocking in here, so we'll give you a few more seconds here. For those of you, we want to make sure you can get your CPE credit by taking all of the survey polling questions in here too. So we'll give you a few more moments here. We're almost to that 75% mark, very close. But I'm very curious to see where we line out in terms of the results of this. But like I said, I would say in the past, risk assessments have been really, really high priority for a lot of folks. Right now, contingency planning seems to be at the top of the list. And then performance audits, those are kind of perennial, fantastic tools that can be used on a regular basis, whether you're in a moment of crisis or things are going well and you want to be focusing on kind of continual improvement too. So I'm curious to see. Okay, we've got our polling results here. Thank you to everyone. Okay, so we've got a good chunk in all of the above. Over 30% of you in the all of the above category interested in the variety here. Risk assessments, financial contingency planning are kind of neck and neck there as well. And congratulations to the 13% of you that have strong risk management practices. That is so exciting to hear. Obviously, we need to do some peer learning here as well, because I think that's fantastic when we can hear from you in terms of what's working. So thank you for that. All right, well, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Maria to quickly walk through enterprise risk assessment.
Thank you, Annie Rose. So I will talk through this quickly in the interest of time, but enterprise risk assessments are a really great tool to systematically identify, evaluate, and prioritize the risks that your organization is facing. When we're thinking about enterprise risk assessment, we're thinking really broadly about any risks that could impact your organization's ability to achieve your mission and goals. So we're going to look at risks like operational risk, strategic risk, governance risk, and compliance risk, all those different risk areas to really help you start to understand where are those vulnerabilities and threats that could be impacting your organization. So this can be a really impactful tool for you as you're thinking about your overhead functions, your internal services areas, and thinking about what's going on in human resources, for example, what's going on in IT, what's going on in finance, how can we identify and sort of bring to the surface all those different risks that we're facing, and then start to prioritize risk mitigation across those different areas. A risk assessment enterprise-wide can really be helpful for your decision-making in terms of where to prioritize your efforts in this area, because that's another key piece here. Is oftentimes there's just so much to do, and maybe there's a lot of different challenges in the organization, and this can really help you to start to think about where do we focus the resources that we do have to have the most impact and the best return on investment for our activities. This is an example of an enterprise risk assessment, just a little snippet of one, of course, but you can see here on the slide where we have some different risk areas. When we do enterprise risk assessments, we are often looking at 15 to 20 different categories depending on the organization. So again, this is just a little snippet of the type of thing that you can do with an enterprise risk assessment. And you can see in this example that IT and cybersecurity is at the top of the list as higher risk. We're looking at things like impact. What's the impact of the risk on the organization? What's the likelihood or probability that the risk is occurring? How prepared is the organization to mitigate against that risk? And then trajectory, meaning is the risk going up, down, or staying the same? And in an enterprise risk assessment, beyond just this high-level summary you see on the slide, it will allow you to sort of break down what all the different risk indicators are in each of these areas, so that you can, for example, start to understand, why is IT and cybersecurity a high risk? Is it challenges with process? Is it system? Is it people? Do we need more staff? And those indicators can help you identify where to look a little bit deeper, because an enterprise risk assessment it's very broad, and we cover a lot when we do an enterprise risk assessment, but we don't go too deep, right? It's meant to say, what are all of those different risks? How do we prioritize them? And then we can dig a little bit deeper with a performance audit or other type of assessment or other type of data analysis and work, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that can help us really pinpoint the key challenges that are driving overhead costs, causing inefficiencies, that opportunities for you to streamline operations. You can use ERAs, again, to identify risks. And I wanted to highlight just a few really key strategies that you should be thinking about if you're going to use an ERA. One is engaging cross-functional teams, because that helps you have a comprehensive understanding of risks across all of your different overhead functions. So folks in departments outside of HR or IT or finance, for example, can really give you insight into how those processes are working. So for example, I'm working with a community college district right now, and one of their big risk areas is related to their recruitment process, which is taking a really long time to facilitate. And we were able to identify that through conversations across the organization, data analysis, and other sorts of inputs that help us understand that's a significant risk for them. It's also important to get feedback from all levels of leadership, ranging from our senior leadership to our staff, to really make sure we have a full picture. Look at historical data and trends to understand recurring issues, and to use those insights to think about where can we mitigate risks and transform these challenges into opportunities for improvement. Common risks in overhead functions are sort of across the board. I'm just going to talk about one or two here, since I know we're running out of time and I want to get to the rest of the sections here for you all. But we're seeing operational risks being really challenging in the overhead space, right? So how do we make sure that we have the most efficient processes? How do we make sure that technology is not getting in our way? That can be really common. We want to make sure we have the right technology that's working for the processes that we have, and that we adjust our processes as we need. And staffing challenges, again, another challenge that we're seeing as a high risk in overhead functions. And I am going to pass it over to Annie Rose to fill us in on contingency planning really quick.
Fantastic. So contingency planning, as I'm sure you all are aware, is thinking ahead of time. If there was major funding disruption, what are our options? What could we do to keep our essential services up and running? And so right now, when there are moments of financial uncertainty, contingency planning really comes to the front. And we want to be able to answer 3 different questions when we're doing contingency planning. So the first is, what are the programs, what are the services that we offer, and what impact do they have for our community? So really understanding your service landscape. Some organizations do this incredibly well already. Others have programs and services that are very interconnected, and it can sometimes be difficult to kind of parse them out. So that's kind of step one. The second one is really understanding your funding sources and also understanding which funding sources are most at risk. And I think that is where a lot of the challenge comes at this particular moment in time, is really understanding what is at risk. There's a lot that's changing in the landscape there. So that question at this moment in time is a little bit more difficult to answer. But in general, being able to say, what are the funding sources that we should be prioritizing or looking at? And finally, for the programs that are funded through those high-risk funding or sources, or the funding sources that are at risk, what options do we have if funding is cut off? What do we have here in terms of, can we reduce the service? Can we fund the service in a different manner? Can we use reserve funds? Do we have other options? What is the kind of broad spectrum of choice? So that the idea is that you do this planning in advance, so that if funding is cut off, you're not having to make those decisions and go through this process in a moment of crisis. So within that contingency planning, the connection with overhead costs is that it can help you prepare for impacts that would be felt within your overhead costs, the impacts to your internal services. Because often what we find is that if we have not prepared in advance and a funding source goes away, we look to our internal services and we look to the funds that are used to fund those areas and kind of strip those back so that we can continue to provide services and programming, which is an absolutely understandable response, but it's not a long-term response. This is not a long-term way of being able to manage and make sure that your organization is going to be sustainable over time. So contingency planning is really critical to help make sure that your overhead costs, both that we're taking them into account and that we're going to be able to plan for them as you move into the future if there are unexpected changes to your funding. So we wanted to give a big shout out to contingency planning on that front. And then the last piece, Maria, I want to talk about performance auditing as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Annie Rose. And I know we just have a minute. Feel free to reach out to us at any point if you'd like to talk more about any of these areas. Performance audits are really helpful if you, for example, already know where in your organization you want to dig a little bit deeper. So if we want to look into the recruitment process example that we had earlier and really try to understand what is it about our recruitment process that's driving costs up, that's not efficient, what do we need to streamline? A performance audit would be a really great tool for you to use to assess your overhead functions. It's an objective assessment of an organization or a program's performance. We're looking at things like efficiency, effectiveness, economy of operations, and often even equity. We're looking at whether or not outcomes are achieved, and importantly, whether resources are being used effectively. Performance audits can be really useful to improve cost effectiveness. We can look at processes and workflows to identify things like bottlenecks and redundancies. This is something we often see. I was working with a recent organization where they had internal services centrally, but there were lots of challenges with those internal services in terms of the processes and the systems that were being used. So the departments across the organization started creating their own versions of those internal services. And that's something we see pretty commonly. And that's something a performance audit can help you really dig into and understand and identify where that makes sense and where that might be leading to inefficiency or increased waste. It can also help you with evaluating things like resource allocation. So really understanding, how are you allocating resources to overhead services? Is that the best way to do it? Is there a better way in terms of being able to produce the best return on investment? Some findings related to overhead, just a little taste of what you might see in a performance audit. Sometimes we see that a significant portion of the budget is allocated to administrative overhead, for example, and doesn't align with peer benchmarks, which could indicate a need for restructuring. So again, going back to that previous example, if we have duplicative internal services across our organization, how might we need to restructure that in our organization to make it the most efficient and effective to work for us as best as it possibly can? We might identify inefficient processes, redundant processes like manual paperwork. That's something we see come up a lot. And it'll help us identify, where can we digitize? Where can we automate processes? Where can we integrate our systems to reduce manual processes? Where can we optimize the systems we already have, or come up with new systems? So again, these are just some quick examples of overhead related findings and performance audits. They are a really great tool to help you dig into those areas, reduce your overhead costs, create more efficiencies. I'm going to wrap us up here and pass it back over to Danielle to close us out.
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you everyone for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us as we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to the presenters directly. Their contact information is in your console as well as in the slide deck, which you can download now from the handouts window. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks as well. Finally, here's a link to the survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated. Again, thank you for joining us, and take care, everyone.